hello. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are presenting Zero Emissions Communities, and our special guest is Matt Lehrman from the City of Boulder. He is the Senior Policy Advisor for Energy Systems. We are delighted to have him here. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn to the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect as non-native people that the land on which we stand, live, and learn is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that our government, academic, and cultural institutions and our nation itself were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, oppression, and inequities, and to recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, create, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Let us seek to understand what it means to be in right relationship today with the traditional stewards of this land and with the land itself and with all creatures that inhabit it. And now, finally, let's get to the main attraction here. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest this evening, Matt Lehrman. Matt will be describing his current work with the City of Boulder throughout the course of his presentation. But he started with the city in July of 2015 as the Energy Strategy Coordinator. In that role, his work focused on financial analysis, rate design, and power supply issues related to Boulder's efforts to create a municipal electric utility and advancing the city's climate commitment objectives at the Public Utilities Commission and developing an electric mobility strategy for the city. Prior to that, Matt worked in the electricity practice at the Rocky Mountain Institute and focused on regulatory and new utility business model issues. Prior to RMI, he worked for Westar Energy, focused on smart grid, distributed generation, and electric transportation programs for the company. Matt received his MBA from the University of Kansas Graduate School of Business, and he continues to be a huge Jayhawk fan. So be sure to let Matt know if you are also. And when he's not working hard in his job at the city, he loves spending his time chasing around his two young children. And so without further ado, thank you so much, Matt, for being our guest tonight. Take it over, please.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary. That was a great background document you put together. I'm very impressed. And
Okay.
yeah, rock chalk Jayhawk, right? Good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Lehrman. As Mary said, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Energy Systems in the Department of Climate Initiatives of the City of Boulder. And I am here tonight to talk a little bit about our Zero Emissions Communities work. I have, for better or for worse, a small number of slides that I'm hoping to use really to spark a conversation and to kind of collect some feedback and have a dialogue about different pathways that the community might take to achieve our zero emissions electricity goals. So I'm going to talk about some of the tools that I think are needed, and I'm going to talk about one way that utility scale generation specific might help us to get to that goal. And as I said, I'm going to ask for some of your feedback on those different pathways. So just as a reminder, these are the community established emissions reduction goals. We are looking to reduce our emissions 70% economy-wide. That's electricity and buildings and transportation. We're looking to reduce 70% by 2030 versus the 2018 baseline. we are looking to be net zero by 2035, carbon positive by 2040. And as a foundation for that, we would like to have our emissions be zero emissions or emissions free by 2030, paired with 100 megawatts of local renewable generation. And I don't know that I've seen official confirmation of that, but if I haven't, I think we are very, very close to having achieved that number of local generation already. But like I said, I think the decarbonization of electricity will serve as the foundation, as the baseline for emissions reduction across buildings and across the transportation sector as well. So it's really important, I think, to get to as low as possible emissions in the electricity sector as quickly as possible, so that we can accelerate the emissions reduction in the other sectors. Fortunately, we're making really good progress. As a brief background here, what this chart shows you is Boulder's electricity sector emissions starting in 2005 and progressing all the way until 2030, with obviously some forecasting done after 2022, and we don't have the data quite yet for obvious reasons. But what you can see is that Xcel's emissions factor in 2005, their pound CO2 per megawatt hour, was over 1,800 pounds. And by 2022, the last year with good data, it was essentially half, or even approximately half of that. So that's really amazing work in 17 years. And what we know, based on the approved portfolio that was just approved in the electric resource plan, we think that number is going to be below 200 by 2030. So, that could be a 90% reduction almost. And so, as you can see, you can really understand that, like, the emissions reduction in the electricity sector it's so substantial. It's really a remarkable achievement. And at the same time, we still have a little bit of work to do. But it serves as a really good foundation for the decarbonization of buildings and transportation through electrification, through the adoption of heat pumps and through the adoption of electric vehicles primarily. It's even more exciting when you think about it on an hourly basis. And this is really important when we think about getting to zero emissions. I think the way that we have tried to calculate our emissions and our renewables has been on an annual basis using an annual average. But what we know is we want to be at zero emissions or 100% renewable in every hour of the day. And so to do that, we really need to look on an hourly basis. Now, what this chart shows is the forecasted average hourly emissions factor from 2024 to 2030. Don't worry about the fine print. I can share the fine print with you later. I know the numbers are small. What I want you to focus on is the colors. And you can look at this chart where 2024 is at the top and 2030 is at the bottom. In the middle of the chart, going straight up the middle columns, that's the middle of the day. And if you use that as the takeaway, what you can see is that we have higher emissions right now in 2024, but as we progress towards 2030, based on what we know that Xcel is going to do with its generation, the average hourly emissions come down really fast, and particularly in the middle of the day. And that's primarily because we have a huge amount of solar, of utility scale solar coming online that is going to, particularly when it's paired with wind blowing in the middle of the day, we can have very low emissions hours of the day. And so this shows us a couple things. One, we're really on a good trajectory on an annual basis. But if we can build tools that not only add more zero emissions generation to the mix, but also help us to shift our usage to when those lower emissions times of day, we can actually do even more work on emissions reduction without adding generation. So we have a couple of tools that we know that are at our disposal, adding generation, but also simply moving our usage to low emission times of day that can really accelerate our emissions reduction. But even now, we see that those are available. I think you can see my cursor. If you cannot, that's okay. Just pretend that I'm looking at the middle of the day at the top of the chart in 2024. Right now, even if you were able to shift your usage to the middle of the day, you can already see 10 to 20% emissions reduction versus the hourly emissions that you see later in the day, in the evening and overnight. And by 2026, as even more utility scale renewables come online, that those savings become even more pronounced, more like on the order of 20 to 30 or even 40% in some hours. So really important that we have the ability not just to add new renewables, but to shift our usage to times of day when emissions are lowest. And that's going to vary every day. And it's not simply as easy as like shifting every day to the middle of the day or to certain hours. But on the whole, if we do have the tools available to us, there are options to reduce emissions starting right now simply by shifting our usage. Another way you can think about the importance of the decarbonization of electricity is simply to look at the average residential customer. This chart might look a little bit complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. What you see here is the average annual CO2 emissions for a residential customer in Boulder, starting in 2018, our baseline year for emissions measurement, and going to 2030 using our forecast of what we think Xcel's mix is going to look like. And so there's a couple of key assumptions here. In 2018 and 2022, we are assuming that the electricity use is just average electricity as you know it today. The gas use is assuming space heating, water heating, cooking is all gas, and transportation is a 25 mile per gallon vehicle. And then the electricity grid emissions are what you're consuming. No additional rooftop solar or anything like that, simply electricity grid emissions. So the takeaways you can take from this are just going from 2018 to 2022, you see a small reduction because the grid is cleaner today, or was in 2022 cleaner than it was in 2018. But the next assumption is when we get to 2030, what I've done here is that, all right, our electricity use is A, by itself going to be cleaner because we know the grid will be cleaner. But B, I've reduced the gas emissions, assuming that space heating is now done with an electric heat pump. We still have gas for water heating and for cooking, but space heating has been electrified, and so it's included in this electricity number. And on the transportation side, I've assumed that you transferred from a 25 mile per gallon vehicle to an electric vehicle. So what you see here is just a substantial reduction in emissions, greater than than our target. So our target is 70% emissions reduction by 2030. And simply those two tools, electrifying your space heating and your transportation, on an individual basis, you'll reduce the average customer will reduce their emissions by more than 70% just using those tools. So I think the high level takeaway is we can do this. And obviously there's substantially more, there's commercial and industrial emissions. But on the residential sector, we have the tools available today. So we have pathways that we know are possible, and it's all built on reducing electricity emissions as quickly as possible. So all of you are here for a specific reason today. What is zero emissions communities? That's what we're here to talk about. In the big picture, zero emissions communities is the tools that we need to reduce electricity emissions to zero. And it's a lot of different things. It's on-site solar and battery storage. It's hourly emissions renewables data, like we just talked about. There's demand response and load flexibility, as we were also talking about shifting our usage to the time of day. There's new tools like microgrids and virtual power plants, which maybe are not directly related, but can certainly be tools that can help us reduce our emissions. And then there's the big things: utility scale generation, battery storage, long duration energy storage. And we've pursued these tools in Boulder and in Colorado in a lot of different ways. I think we all are somewhat familiar with our on-site solar work in Boulder. I think roughly we have probably 80 to 85 megawatts of local solar already installed, plus our hydro that's in Boulder. We went to the legislature and we passed what's called the 200% rule, allowing people, residents and businesses, to build more solar on their roof than was previously allowed. We've also pushed through both at the legislature and at the PUC rules for virtual net metering and net metering for multifamily and multifamily houses and multi-tenant businesses. So you can have some of the same benefits of on-site solar as if you were, a single-family residential. On the hourly emissions and renewable side, we've been advocating for this for years in the Renewable Energy Standard Plan in 2021, in the Strategic Issues Plan in 2022, and the Transportation Electrification Plan, currently right now in the demand side management plan. So we've been really pushing a lot of different angles to make hourly emissions and renewables data available so that we can shift load. I think you've seen that a little bit. There's a program called Charging Perks that is in part designed to help customers charge with electric vehicles, charge their cars at lower emission times of day. And we're hoping to make some improvements to that so it better reflects when more renewables are available. There, as you see in red here, there's going to be an update to the time of use rates coming this fall. And that is also intended to help better align time of use with when more renewables are available. Within microgrids and virtual power plants, we've applied for a Department of Energy grant focused on virtual power plants using some of our distributed resources in Boulder. Again, you see in red, there's the 2024 wildfire mitigation plan, which there will be more discussion of later this year, but will be an opportunity to think about microgrids and how they can, particularly a renewable fueled microgrid, can provide some amount of resilience to the community. And then on the utility side, there's a few different ways you can propose. You can add utility scale generation. We made a proposal within the electric resource plan, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also made a proposal within the renewable energy standard plan to build what is essentially a large scale battery that would help to reduce the curtailment of existing renewables. We called it a community storage garden, similar to a community solar garden, except for just battery storage, but designed to help improve the usage of existing renewables. And then later this summer, there will be what's called the Just Transition Plan. It's kind of an interim resource plan to solicit utility scale generation that will be added in 2028, 2029, 2030. So a few different options that we have available to us to think about utility scale generation, potentially new technology like different forms of long duration energy storage. But at a very high level, these are the kinds of things these are the tools that we think are necessary to really get to zero emissions electricity. It's not just going to be one tool. It's not going to be two. It's probably going to be a mix of all of these. It has to be a mix of all of these in certain ways. But specifically, I want to talk a little bit tonight about the utility scale portion of this. So we know that, as I was saying, all of the tools I just described are important for getting to zero emissions. But given the scale of emissions that still remain, even though it's decreasing the scale, we think that utility scale resources can play an important role, both from just the rapid acceleration because of how much you get from a larger resource versus a smaller resource, but also in terms of cost and also in terms of resource diversity, not relying on just one type of resource, but kind of having a mix. So we do think that utility scale resources have a role to play, not by themselves, but certainly paired with the other tools that I was showing earlier. And as I showed, on the emissions reduction scale, a lot of the reduction achievements that have happened today are because we've added utility scale wind, utility scale solar, and used those to not only retire, in many cases, early the remaining coal, but also to reduce the usage of the existing gas as well. So not the only tool, but an important tool. And one thing that we've seen, particularly in the last two ERPs, is that there's typically quite a few projects that are bid that are not selected. And what we've heard from the community over years is, why can't we select those bids? If they're on the table and they're viable and they're cost effective, shouldn't there be a way that interested customers and communities can add them? We said, yes, of course there is. How do we do that? And so what we proposed in the resource plan, the electric resource plan in 2021, was a tool for customers and communities that have more aggressive goals in Xcel in terms of emissions reduction to be able to do that, not only to help meet their own emissions reduction goals, but add new resources to benefit the entire grid and reduce system-wide emissions. And the Public Utilities Commission agreed and said, Boulder, Xcel, you should work on this together and develop this idea, determine if it's possible, is there a rate design that you can come up with to do this, how would customers participate, what types of resources, what are we looking at, what's the scale of emissions reduction. So we spent the better part of the year doing that, and we did some forecasting of what we thought Boulder's consumption would be out to 2030, taking into account, changes in the community and increased electrification, EVs and heat pumps and so forth, and said, all right, here's what we think our usage is going to be. Here's what we think Xcel's kind of baseline grid mix is going to be. And then can we add various amounts of battery storage, of solar, of wind, and different combinations? And what types of emissions reduction can we get? So in our initial modeling, based on what we thought the grid would look like, we thought our 2030 electricity emissions would be something like 175,000 short tons. So what you can see here is it's certainly possible with different resources, particularly utility scale solar and wind, potentially paired with battery, to hit that goal in 2030. This was all done based on generic resources that's presented in the first part of the electric resource plan. So not actual bids. We didn't know what the actual costs were going to be. We didn't know what the locations were going to be, if they were viable projects. But we said, just kind of generically speaking, we think we can get there. And we said, all right, let's wait until the actual bids come in and see if our hypothesis proves out that there are extra bids that are available, that are viable, that are cost effective, that can produce the types of emissions reduction on the scale that we want, on the scale of what Boulder's 2030 emissions would be. And those bids came in September of last year. And ultimately, the commission approved a portfolio of resources that I think we're probably on the, in terms of the scale of our emissions, we're probably about correct, maybe a little bit high, a little bit low. But ultimately, we got to a point where we said, all right, there are some wind and solar bids on the table. There's some battery bids on the table. There's also some innovative tech on the table that are non-traditional resources that potentially also have benefits, may or may not be able to get the types of emissions reduction that we want on the scale that we want, but that might play an important role in getting the entire system from, say, 80% renewable to 100. And so ultimately, that is where we're at right now. It's a decision point of saying, what types of resources do we want to add, and how are we going to add? And so this is where I want to kind of open up the conversation to everyone. I hope I didn't drone on for too long in my presentation. I think I had about 20-ish minutes or so. But if we want to pursue a utility scale program in Boulder, what are the possible options? So on one hand, we could look, I'm not sure which stuff I have to put my screen, I have to be on screen to see my cursor. But you see an option here where there's one option where we add capacity and energy equal to our requirements. So we look at Boulder's share of Xcel's generation and we say, what is the fossil-based component share of that? And then can we add zero emissions capacity and energy to essentially balance that out? The second option would be to say, as I've been describing earlier, what's our share of the system emissions going to be in 2030? And what types of resources can we add to reduce the system-wide emissions on that scale? So it's not necessarily system-wide zero emissions, but we've made a contribution on the scale of Boulder to reduce system-wide emissions from what we think would otherwise be contributing. And then, as I just mentioned, there's a third option that would be something like what I would call demonstrating firm, dispatchable, zero emissions technology. It's looking for kind of the next generation of technology, say something like compressed air energy storage, or there are people that talk about advanced geothermal, that new types of geothermal generation that might be a bit more viable in Colorado than it has been previously. But things like that might more effectively in the long term get us to zero emissions on a system-wide basis. And the idea would be that if we invest in them now, we might be able to accelerate the broader deployment of them, because we're providing tests that will then say, all right, we built this project at one cost, the next project's going to be less cost, it's going to take less time. The project after that's going to be lower cost, taking less time, and so forth. So maybe instead of Xcel getting to zero emissions in 2050, it could be 2045, it could be 2040, it could be 2035, depending on what we're able to do. So those three options that you see in green aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. We can pursue different versions of them together or separately. But I think those are maybe the general three pathways that we've been thinking about and talking about with Xcel. And then, as you can see in blue, there's a separate question of, would this program be for Boulder only, or to be available for all customers? And I think there are advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons to both. But ultimately, that is kind of the platform that we've set up for conversation. And those are, I think, some of the choices we have to think about if we want to go down the pathway of pursuing a utility scale program to help meet our electricity emissions reduction goals. That is where I want to turn it over to you. I would love to hear your feedback. I would love to hear questions. I imagine there are questions from previously in my presentation. We can talk through those and then work to this slide. But I know there's a lot of interesting and questions out there. I don't know that we have the answers to this, and so I turn to you and say, what should we do?
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. That's a very interesting approach to getting to zero emissions communities. We do have a number of questions, and I'll just work my way through them. So let's see. What is the city planning for reducing gas use in the commercial and industrial sector? And what percentage of the natural gas use is in the C&I sector?
On the latter question, off the top of my head, I want to say it's probably 3/4 of the usage. I don't know if any of my colleagues are on the line that might have more specific numbers on that, but just in terms of emissions from the gas sector for commercial and industrial, it's on the scale of probably like 3/4 or maybe even more. I hate to say it like this, but I also have separate colleagues that are working on the decarbonization of the commercial and industrial sector for gas. And so I think I can certainly put together a response for you, but I don't want to kind of speak out of turn in this moment on that topic. But I know there are efforts underway. It's probably the best I can say in this moment.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what trajectory does the city project for electrifying transportation and heating for low and moderate income residents? Please show a quantitative projection. And if it isn't available, what is the city's plan for creating a quantitative projection for electrification for LMI residents?
That's a really good and important question. I think the goals that we've established as far as mobility electrification are to electrify 30% of vehicles in the community by 2030. So it's not really specific to just one type of customer. It's it's all customers. I think within that we have efforts underway to add primarily charging stations at all types of housing, whether it's single family and multifamily. We know that access to home charging is one of the top probably 2 or 3 barriers to vehicle electrification. So to the extent we can add charging across all types of housing, whether it's single family or multifamily, I think is going to meet the needs of all residential customers, regardless of income level. We are, as we've been talking a little bit, and there'll be more information available next week. We're testing different types of technology like bi-directional charging in partnership with Boulder Housing Partners as a means of potentially bringing down the cost of vehicle electrification for all customers. But that includes electrification of some of the Colorado car share fleet. To be very specific, I don't need to dodge the actual question. I don't have like a quantified analysis of what the trajectory is for low and moderate income customers beyond this general target of 30% for the entire community fleet.
Great, thank you. Another question is, who pays for the zero emissions community? Shouldn't this investment be of benefit to Xcel shareholders, and therefore shouldn't Xcel pay for it?
That's a really good question. I think if I understand it. So on the last slide, I showed the 2 blue boxes. There is this question of, should a program like this be for Boulder customers or should it be for all Xcel customers? And I think within that, part of your answer comes from that. If it's just for Boulder customers would pay. If it's for all customers, then it's a matter of subscribing customers that are paying. But within that, the price is unknown. And I think the way that we have devised the program is that there would be a price you pay to subscribe, and then a benefit you receive for the values that are brought to the whole system. So primarily in avoided energy and capacity costs. And the net of that is what you can see on your bill. It could be positive or negative, depending on the price of the resource that we're buying. So is it solar? Is it geothermal, for example? But then alternatively, what is the avoided cost that you're saving? So when you look at a program that Xcel has, like Renewable Connect right now, which was devised several years ago, I think for the last couple of years, the subscribers, the people that were fortunate enough to get into it, it's a very small program. They've actually seen it's been a discount because the value of the solar has actually brought down system costs a little bit. In the first couple of years, it was a premium. It was in the second part of it, it's updated every year, but it's actually been a discount. But to the second part of your question, I think there's also maybe an open question about who owns the resources, and is it the subscribing customers? Is it Xcel? I think with Renewable Connect, as I mentioned, Xcel doesn't own that solar; it's sold as a PPA. I think there might be a version of this program in which the subscribing customers actually own part of it, and then it's a question of, again, including that in the cost of the resource and the avoided cost and capacity, or the avoided capacity and energy costs that you're saving. So again, is it all Boulder customers? Is it open to any Xcel customer? Probably is going to depend on the scale of the resource and what's available. But those are potential answers, but no firm answer on that yet, because it's going to kind of depend on the program.
Okay, thank you. Here's the next one. I thought that PUC rules prevented Xcel from doing anything that benefits only Boulder. So wouldn't any Xcel program affect all Xcel ratepayers equally?
I don't know that the rules specifically prevent something from only benefiting Boulder. I think any application can be made, and in the context of the rules, and you say, here are customers that have agreed to subscribe to this program, and here's how and as long as you have designed it in such a way where the non-participating customers aren't affected, that's okay. And I think you see that Xcel has an economic development rate to try to attract new customers, particularly large customers, to its service territory, and they have kind of a separate rate. And if you qualify for it, you can be on that rate, but it's certainly intended for those customers and not for everyone. In the same way, a program like this could be designed in such a way that as long as the non-participating customers are held harmless, although they will probably benefit from the emissions reduction and probably the improved air quality, as you can imagine, then I think it would be okay. I don't know if there's something specifically preventing that, but I think it's kind of, again, part of the program design.
Great, okay. And here's another one. It says, thanks for recognizing that the grid is cleaner during the day and will get increasingly clean during the day, but currently Xcel promotes usage at night and early morning. What concrete plans does the city of Boulder have to move usage to the middle of the day? And how can we get Xcel to stop penalizing usage during the times the grid is cleanest? Please also address the curtailment issue. What is it and how can we help avoid it?
Yeah, these are really good questions. I feel like this is like a midterm exam. Need a few minutes to jot my notes here. So I think that we've spent the better part of the last 4 or 5 years in different proceedings at the Public Utilities Commission proposing different ways that Xcel could share information on hourly renewables and emissions with customers, both on a granular basis, on in a broad spectrum, focused on different specific uses like electric vehicle charging. And I'd like to think we're very close to having some amount of success on that. I think that the commission has acknowledged most recently in Xcel's rate case that the entire generation mix has changed over time, right? And there are lower emissions and lower cost resources that are, available during the day. I think that, and they ordered a change, an early change, like a 1-year early change in the time of use rates as an acknowledgement of that. So I think the pieces are coming into place, and like I said, I think I'm very optimistic that there's going to be some amount of success on this very soon to be able to say, here's what the hourly emissions are. To the extent you can change when you're using electricity, you can do that because it's going to be 10, 20, 30, 50% cheaper at these times of day. So I think we've been proposing that in different ways for a long time. You can email me after, and I can share the different proposals that we've made. They're all available through the Public Utilities Commission. So we're working on it. We're getting close, I think. The second part of your question was curtailments. So, I mean, this is my understanding of the curtailment issue. Renewables generate when they generate, right? When the wind's blowing and the sun is shining. And, electricity is generally consumed as soon as it's generated. And there's two things that could prevent that. One, there can be a mismatch of when that generation happens. So there's not enough demand relative to how much generation there is. So in that case, they're going to curtail. They're going to say, we don't need this power. It could have been generated because the sun is shining right now, it's blowing right now, but there's simply not enough demand to use it. So one idea, as we've been talking about, is to say, tell people that, and they can say, oh, instead of charging my car, overnight, I'm just going to wait until 9 in the morning because it looks like it's going to be really windy and the sun will be shining, so the emissions are going to be like half what they were overnight. And if I don't need my car charged until 2 in the afternoon, it doesn't really matter if I'm charging at midnight or 8 a.m. Right? So that's one way to think about curtailments, is let's increase usage to match when the wind and solar is blowing. It's not otherwise needed by just general usage. The other is probably maybe like a more technical reason. It relates to like available capacity on the transmission system. And I don't know how frequently this happens in Colorado, but I think you could imagine that sometimes the transmission system is just so congested that sometimes not everything can get through, right? And so I think that's lesser. But I think what's important to think about is that the scale of the curtailments has been relatively high, but it's coming down. I think probably on the scale of like in 2022 is probably on the scale of like 4,000 megawatt hours a day, which is a lot if you think about EV charging, or you think about just general home usage that you could shift. I think last year, 2023, it was probably, I don't know, something like half of that, or 2,500. And I think this year already in 2024, it's even lower, probably less than, probably 1,500, 1,700 megawatt hours a day of curtailment. So definitely better. But there's definitely a lot of curtailment that's happening. Those are average numbers, right? Some days it's probably going to be no curtailments. Other days it might be way more than that. But the point is, to the extent that customers can be made aware of that potential for curtailment and plan their usage accordingly, that can be really valuable just in terms of making better use of the existing renewables that are available. The other way that you could address it, obviously, would be to build battery storage of some kind, whether it's distributed batteries across every house or large utility scale batteries. But if there was going to be curtailment, you could store it to then be used later when you need it, then that might be helpful. And that's what we proposed, as I was talking about earlier, in the 2021 renewable energy plan, to say, instead of all these community solar gardens, why don't you build a community storage garden? Like, customers subscribe to that, but they're not really having this electricity delivered to their house. They're just supporting more storage that can store renewables that otherwise would be curtailed. That was not approved by the PUC, but it's something that we have advocated for and probably will continue to do so going forward. Was that all the questions on that topic? I think
that, let me ask you, were you involved in the application for the R for the transportation electrification plan that the city filed with the PUC?
That is an active request right now. Yes, the city did file that.
Can you speak just a little bit about that? It seems aligned with the last question.
It does, yes. So, I mean, I guess at a very high level, I think there was a proposal to present this hourly information that was made by the staff of the Public Utilities Commission, and the discussion of that didn't make it into the decision. So we were really just seeking like clarification of that. Like, did the commission vote to approve that or not? And if so, it should be in the decision.
Great, thank you. Next question is, please elaborate on the status of the zero emissions community proposal at the PUC. Do we have the option to move forward? And if so, is the cost or savings being calculated?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like the feedback that I want tonight. I think like the options that I kind of laid out, I think are on the table for us. So do we want to add, renewable capacity and energy that would kind of offset what our, Boulder share of Xcel's fossil generation would be? Do we want to add some type of resources that are going to bring system-wide emissions down on the scale of Boulder? Do we want to look more to some of the more like innovative tech, things that might bring the entire system closer to zero emissions more quickly than otherwise would? So that's what's on the table right now. I think probably the one near-term option might be that solicitation that happens later this year as part of the Just Transition Plan. I think there might be other ways to propose this as well, but I think there's an open question about, what types of resources are we looking for right now, and then what is the scale of emissions reduction?
Okay, thank you. Next question, what is the latest estimate for Xcel's Colorado system carbon reductions by 2030 compared to 2005?
Yeah, so I tried to capture that. I went a little bit quickly through one of the earlier slides, but I think based on the update to their resource plan that they just filed in April, I think the average annual emissions factor is below 200 pounds CO2 per megawatt hour, compared to over 1,800 in 2005. So, as I was saying, like the hourly is actually what's more important. We generally calculate our emissions based on that average hourly, but we actually really need to start calculating it more like the hourly emissions, and then what is our hourly usage, and that'll give us a much more granular look at what our actual emissions are, which then informs the types of decisions we want to make in terms of load shifting, distributed resources, utility scale resources. But just looking at it on an average basis, it's something like 1,850 down to like 200 or less. I think I've calculated it at like 1.5. But as I also showed on that next chart, I think there will, based on the average forecast, I think there'll be hours that are very close to zero in some seasons, particularly spring seasons like April, May, where solar is really generating when the wind is blowing. The load is very low because there's very little air conditioning. You can imagine hours that are starting to get like very, very close to zero. Not throughout the whole year, not all day, but it's the building blocks of where we go.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what are your top 2 or 3 hurdles / blocks to achieving our goal?
It's a great question. It's the obvious question. I don't know that I'm properly prepared for it. I think there's a number of interesting barriers. I don't know that they're big or small. I don't know that any of them are insurmountable. But one, as I keep saying, is like, what's the pathway that we want to go down? Is it traditional resources like wind and solar and battery storage? Do we want to look at something a little bit more innovative? Is it a mix of that? So I think just answering that question is important. I think answering the second question about like, should this be Boulder owned or system wide? I think that's really important as well. I think particularly when we think about the innovative tech, I think there is the risk of the technology. Like, is it going to work or is it not? What's the cost of it? It's could be very competitive, or it could be almost cost prohibitive in a certain way, but in a way that says, if we do this now for whatever, $50 a megawatt hour, knowing that the next one's going to be 30 and then 20 and then 25, that maybe we want to like start moving that can down the road in the same way that people that were putting solar on their roofs in 2000 or 2002 or 2005 at prices that are 20 times higher than today, would enable the price to come down to what it is today. So I think that's a really interesting philosophical question that we have to kind of think about. Yeah, those probably at the top of my head are some big ones. But I think the other big one is thinking about what are we know that the grid is getting very clean and that there's huge benefit to adding heat pumps and electric vehicles. So how do we not lose sight of that and make sure that what we're building can continue to accelerate the emissions reduction in electricity, but also ensure that we can support these new distributed resources that are coming out, because they add new types of challenges to the operation of the grid, just in terms of peak demand and types, how we built the distribution system, but then also thinking about, resilience and thinking about outages, for example, and people are still going to want to charge their car and heat their houses. I know I am, I can't speak for everyone. And so how can we build, how do we make sure that we're not relying just on utility scale resources to meet our goals? That because of things like EVs and heat pumps, we know that distributed generation, that battery storage, microgrids, virtual power plants, things like that are going to be, important tools as well. So how do we make sure we're not, just putting our eggs into one basket and solving one problem as it existed, 10 years ago? It was one thing 10 or 12 years, 15 years ago to just buy a lot of wind and solar because we knew it was going to build, reduce emissions very quickly and at a good price. But now it's like, well, we actually don't want to focus on specific hours, and we want to make sure that EVs can charge and heat pumps can heat and cool, and that everybody has access to it as well. We've learned more, and so we want to make sure that those factors were kind of all taken into consideration, and we're not just putting our eggs into one basket.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what can Boulder staff and council do to support a community choice energy bill so it will be introduced that will benefit residents who want to choose a cleaner energy mix?
That's a good question. I think it probably, I'm not super involved with the legislature. I don't mean to kind of punt on this question. I think it's probably going to depend on how the bill is designed and who can participate. I think whatever is going to be designed, it's got to be cleaner than what Xcel's offering. And so I think that's really important. I think making sure that, probably access to the transmission system is solved in a way that, a new provider could interconnect and build resources, but I'm not an expert in how the legislature operates. And so I kind of have to punt on that one in a certain way, not even because I have an opinion one way or the other on it, just, it's a different question, I guess.
Okay, moving on to our next question. This is partly a question and probably a statement. What do we know about the costs of the various options in your last slide? It is hard to have a serious discussion on options without a sense of the various costs.
Yeah, I think we have a good idea of what wind and solar can cost, although it's pretty variable depending on where it is in Colorado. We have a better sense of batteries. I think it's less clear about the innovative tech. I think there was some of that presented in the last resource plan. When you look at the various portfolios that were presented, some of them had biomass projects or compressed air projects or green hydrogen projects or geothermal projects, and you kind of tease out what the costs are, and the storage projects are probably a little bit more cost competitive. The newer generation probably a little bit less so, but short of something being totally cost prohibitive, we're talking about solar and batteries for say $35. If there was some new tech that was $1,000, it's not really reasonable. But if we were looking, I'd be interested to hear feedback, and if we were saying this solar and batteries is $35 and it gets us part of the way to our emissions goals, and geothermal is twice that. And it doesn't get us all the way there, but we know that it's going to scale very quickly as a result, or our opinion is that it's going to scale. Is that worth it? So I think we can probably, whoever answered that question, call me up and we can kind of walk through the different portfolios and kind of tease out what we think the cost might have been for those different projects. But it's a bit uncertain, and it's part of the challenge in developing this. And part of it will be if we said, hey, we really want to go this innovative tech route, I think we'd probably push for having some sort of like new solicitation to specifically say we want this in this location, what's available, if any.
Great, thank
But
you.
also that's also one of the risks. There might be nothing. So, something to consider.
So the next question is, it says, I am reluctant to get an air source heat pump until I get solar, which is delayed due to contracting my roof/attic project. I have a way to get it through CARE due to low income, but I don't want to use it because my electricity will be higher use with coal from Xcel. What to do?
Well, in terms of the electricity consumption, yes, when you put the heat pump in, your usage will go up. I think, fortunately, Xcel's grid is maybe 20% coal and pretty rapidly decreasing. So, in terms of emissions, I think we're pretty confident today that if your usage and cost, if you can accept that, we know that the heat pump is going to reduce your emissions relative to heating your home with gas. So if you're only focused on the emissions, the heat pump is still the option, even with the amount of coal that Xcel has on its grid today. But certainly, I can understand the opinion, the situation regarding just like the increased usage and associated increased costs. We probably have to probably call me to talk about comparing the increased usage of the electricity to what your gas use otherwise would have been, try to get a sense of like what the cost breakdown would be. But it's probably the best I can say out there, without more information.
Great, thank you. Next question is, how confident are you in Xcel demonstrating progress towards our goal before the 2025 ballot, given that they have missed their intermediate goals recently? Is there something we can do to help move that forward successfully?
I think Xcel's making progress. I don't have a crystal ball into 2025 specifically. If the second part of the question is how can we make sure that we meet the targets? Like I said, we're really hoping that we're going to make some progress on this hourly emissions question, and simply being able to shift usage around is going to be helpful. But yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball to know exactly what Xcel's system was built like next year. We have like an idea of it based on some of the forecasts they presented, but I think it's going to come down to usage and how much renewable is available.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, I may have missed a difference in time ranges, but you had a graph showing about a 90% emissions reduction by 2030, and later a table projecting the residential sector emissions reducing by about 80%. I'm guessing C and I are tougher than residential. So did I miss something?
Well, no and yes, but not in a bad way. I thought that was a little confusing, and I apologize for that. The residential slide, includes some amount of gas use as well, because for your water heating and cooking, I didn't assume it was full electrification. So the first slide that looked at Boulder, the system-wide electricity, that was only electricity, but there was a little bit additional emissions on the gas side for residential. Does that answer the question? Was there a separate part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a good response. We're approaching the 7 o'clock hour. Do you have time to stay beyond? We have plenty of questions.
Sure.
Okay. The next one is long. Hi, Matt. Based on the recent blackout, how would resiliency/redundancy integrate with the utility scale solutions? Won't a more localized solution be required when the grid goes down? Is local storage up to the task with today's technology? I have conducted recent site assessments for transportation electrification projects within the city that have new methane combustion gensets for critical infrastructure at building load. Are the economics of local storage still not penciling out? Thanks.
It's a good question. I'm smiling because my daughter walked in. She's making a face. And if she has a question, I'll take that one too. But yeah, so I think that they're two separate parts of the same question. I think that the distributed side, the microgrids, virtual power plants are going to be a really important part of zero emissions very broadly. It's a different tool trying to solve the same problem. So I think what we'll pursue on the utility scale side is going to be separate from what we pursue on the local distributed side. Just as we've been building local solar for a long time, when we start to look at local storage and microgrid type projects, we'll do that separately. It's more than anything, it's easier that way. But they're really trying to solve different problems, and I think the way that we get them approved at the QC are different. So we'll keep them separate. But yes, I think that the distributed side is extremely important because it allows us to solve different problems like resilience during outages, and so it's just a different tool for a different part of the same problem.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, has the city of Boulder analyzed where microgrids backed by storage would give more resiliency in times of de-energizing? The franchise agreement called for a microgrid, and has that been implemented? And if so, where?
I have another colleague, not to again defer to other colleagues, who thinks a little bit more deeply about the distribution system, and he's done some amount of work on thinking about this. I think when we have thought about microgrids, I mean, at a very high level, thinking about critical facilities, operate, both from like the water treatment and wastewater treatment, but also in terms of like community hubs, things like rec centers that can serve as some amount of shelter for certain people. And so, I don't know that we could say we have a specific microgrid in place. I think microgrid means a lot of different things. It can mean one home or one building, or it could mean maybe a section of distribution feeder. And those are different, you need different tools, and kind of trying to solve different problems with those. But I think, we have the tools in place in some of our facilities already. Think about, for example, North Boulder Rec Center that has, solar on the, and we already have a battery unit connection there with our bidirectional charging. We have the ability to really plug in more directly into that transformer. So I think some of the tools are in place to be able to island that building already. We could certainly do it with like a diesel generator today. So we could operate that as a microgrid. It wouldn't be a zero emissions microgrid, but we have some amount of that ability, in place today. But I think there is kind of the next phase of work, and some of that will unfold, I think, within this wildfire mitigation plan that Xcel is going to propose later this year. And I think there'll be opportunities to develop microgrids, and I think we'll be able to look and say, here are sites that we can, probably build a microgrid of some form, whether it's one building or multi-building. Like I said, those are kind of different problems to solve with different needs. But I think that's what's going to be squarely on the table in a proceeding like that, in addition to other things that can, mitigate the impacts of wildfire.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I think you said that of 45% of our registered vehicles are renters. How can we help get more public chargers to our renter-dense neighborhoods, especially in neighborhoods with poor driveway access and/or minty renters who have multiple vehicles with, say, one plug access? Example, more chargers at rec centers, or say a neighborhood like Tantra.
Really good question, really hard question. And I think I've spent a lot of time trying to solve this problem. So I think in general, we can add access to home charging, that's the most important thing. You know, I think something like 70%, 75% of EV drivers do their charging. EV drivers in general do about 75% of their charging at home, and for something like half the drivers, they do all their charging. And home charging is just it's convenient. It's like a huge benefit of driving an EV is being able to plug in at home. So if we can facilitate that, it just makes the transition to EVs way easier and it's just better. It's a better part of the technology. But the second part of it is, you know, just from an equity perspective, it's more affordable. Like generally speaking, home charging is just less expensive than any type of public charging, whether it's slow or fast public charging. There's, I think, also benefits to the grid operations. You know, when we think about using EVs to whether it's bidirectional or not, I think it's easier to do some amount of demand response for home charging for public charging. It's very, very difficult, much more difficult for demand response with EV charging for public. So for those three reasons, I really we're trying to remove all of the barriers for people to access home charging. That said, you know, I've lived in 2 different single-family homes in Boulder that did not have off-street parking, no garage, no driveway, and it's really challenging to buy EV and operate it. You can do it, but it just makes it more difficult. So I think the options we've looked at are, yes, adding more public chargers. And we've done that in a limited way, but also the market is pretty dynamic at this point. You know, the city added its first chargers at rec centers in 2012, preceding my time in Boulder by, you know, a couple of years. But now there's multiple, you know, large companies that are doing fast charging in Boulder. Tesla has fast chargers in Vigo, Electrify America, ChargePoint, all have fast chargers in Boulder. So there's a certain amount of, you know, how do we work with them to expand sites? Does the city have sites that are amenable to that, or is it really then connecting them with private landowners at fast charging? Level 2 charging can certainly be added. We have just opened, you know, more level 2 chargers at the Flatirons Golf Course with the new community building that's there. So there's some that are coming online as the new stations. I mean, the most popular EV charging stations in the city generally are Scott Carpenter Pool and the Belmont Bike and Dog Park and rec centers, because people dwell there and they're possible. So if we can add more chargers there, that's great. There's kind of premium for parking sometimes, but it's also not necessarily the best way to, you know, to encourage EV adoption, because if you don't have home charging, public level 2 charging is a challenging way to make it work. So focusing on levels, you know, on home charging access where we can, and then separately really encouraging the fast chargers, I think is really important. There's a third way that, you know, we've kind of, I don't know if there's a good solution for yet, is, you know, in terms of curbside charging. There's a lot of maybe operational challenges. None of them are insurmountable, but I think trying to work through those and understand how and where curbside charging might work is probably important as well.
Great, thank you. Next question. How can this time of use be automated or as an option for Boulder Power and Light versus Xcel? And once the use is flat, how can Xcel make money other than contributing to population growth initiatives? I take from that is like, you know, is there some way one could get a signal or something that would automate, you know, your selection of what appliances are on that according to what rate structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are appliances today that you can buy and you can set them to run or not run at certain times. I mean, like Xcel's time of use rates are not real time, so they don't change every hour. It's pretty well defined window of time. So you can pull into your garage and plug in your car, but set it to not charge until, say, midnight, for example. I know there's dishwashers that you can do similar. So there's things like that you can do to automate some of it. Some of it's probably going to be manual. I don't know if you can do that with your clothes dryer or, you know, things like that. So I think there's some amount of automation today, if that answers the question. I don't know that I have an opinion on the second one, not to pun that, but I don't know that I have a good answer on the second part.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is SB 218 mandates performance-based compensation to postsumers for power, capacity, ancillary services, reserves, and wire deferrals. Will this profitable value stack entice the non-woke to invest in DERs? So you may need to unpack some of that.
I probably the best thing I can say is I hope so. You know, as I was saying earlier, I'm not an expert on the legislature, and I don't actually know the details of all of that legislation. But I think to the extent we're putting, you know, public-facing prices on more services that the grid needs, that you could probably offer with your home solar or your battery or your EV charging, the better. You know, it makes it more economical, makes it more accessible. I think you probably still need companies to help you actually deliver that. You know, I don't know that everyone's going to sit at home all day and charge their car at certain times. Some amount of automation needs to happen, I think. But to the extent all of that information is placed and it's public, it's probably better for everyone.
Okay, thank you. Next one is please describe VPP, Virtual Power Plant grant that the city submitted.
Yeah, so we submitted a grant application with Xcel to that would fund the development of a virtual power plant, and we look at a few different feeders in Boulder that have a relatively high penetration of not even so much so there is a lot of solar, just because there is a lot of solar in Boulder everywhere, but more controllable loads that can be used to kind of simulate the services that a power plant might otherwise provide, like a big utility scale. So there's some amount of demand response, there's some amount of battery storage, there's some amount of charging on the different feeders, and you know, I think the idea. Let me see if I have some notes on that I can look at really quickly. But you know, I think the general idea is, can we combine these different resources to actually, as I was saying, can we reduce peak demand? Can we provide like voltage support for the grid? Can we reduce curtailment in any way because we are controlling shifting load with different types of resources? Can we reduce congestion on the transmission distribution system? Is there ways to just better plan the distribution infrastructure so you know, as new infrastructure is added, to size transformers properly, or right size them might be a better way of thinking about it, because we have distributed resources that are managing load rather than just assuming peak load is going to continue to grow. So, you know, I hope to hear back later this summer on that, but I think that's the general idea of what the grant to do is use those distributed resources in Boulder to provide some or all.
Okay, thank you. Next question is Xcel filed a zero emissions community update in March 2023. Is that the most recent proposal, or has something else happened since then? I still don't see what you mean by these proposals are on the table. If they are on the table, how can we learn some more about the details if they aren't on the table? Will they be? And if so, when?
Yeah, so that was the slide I showed earlier that was showing different amounts of emissions reduction. That was the update we provided to say, before we've received any bids within the resource plan, if we just use what we think like a generic type of solar resource can provide with battery storage with assessment of what the market prices would be, here is the types of emissions reductions we think we could get. Then we, you know, waited for probably the better part of the next, say, 6 months to actually get the actual bids. And then we had to wait until there was an actual approved portfolio in the resource plan. So that was like January of this year. And now we're at that point where I think there's an opportunity to say, yes, we would like to investigate the possibility of building more wind and solar, battery storage. Do we want to look at more innovative tech? how much are we trying to build? Is it trying to really like offset Boulder's share of Xcel's fossil generation? Or are we just looking at emissions reduction? And what do we need to build to get to that? And so the point where we're at now is what's the best path forward?
Okay, great, thank you. The next I have is a three-part question. Would increased electricity demand during the day encourage building more renewable energy?
I mean, I would hope that's a great question. It's probably different for every utility. I would hope so, just in the context of like renewables being, comparatively inexpensive. And so I'd like to think that a lot of, new demand is going to be met by renewables. But, I think it probably will vary by utility and what they have. And the prices at any given time. I mean, I think as we've seen with renewables, prices kind of go up and down based on supply chain, based on interest rates. And so I think whenever you're building new or soliciting new resources, there's going to be a risk of building fossil. But I'd like to think that the renewables are pretty competitive right now.
Thank you. Next question of the three-part is, how would more local generation impact the zero emissions community plan?
I mean, so zero emissions community, as I was saying, is a number of different types. It's utility scale, it's distributed, it's load shifting because of hourly emissions, and so local generation is not going to affect the utility scale. I mean, it might reduce by some amount the amount of utility scale we might want to build if we're looking to reduce system-wide emissions. But there's not really any barriers at this point to building local. So there's still going to be more that's built because people are adding solar. I think there are opportunities to add more distributed storage, just as a means of improving resilience. So you can use your solar when the lights are out, kind of thing, if there's an outage. But I think they're separate parts. They're separate tools working at the same problem, right?
Okay. And then how are needs for more transmission affected by zero emission communities?
I mean, which tool, right? So ideally, like local generation is reducing some amount of need for new transmission, although you really need to start building a lot of it to have a substantial need. The same with like load shifting, because there's a certain amount of, if we can shift usage, there's again ideally deferring some amount of need for new transmission. On the utility scale side, it's kind of unknown. It kind of depends where it is, and if there's enough transmission capacity, or if you need to build new. And I think you even see, in this most recent resource plan, there's a lot of new renewables coming online, but there's new transmission associated with it because of either there's not existing transmission capacity, or because where the project is built, there's just no transmission at all. So there's just a certain amount. When you start to get into utility scale, generally speaking, you're going to need transmission. You can find somewhere in Boulder to build 200 megawatts of solar or something like that, and not have to add transmission. And I don't know that that's possible.
Okay. Next question. Can you get a fast charge in your own place for a reasonable cost?
If by fast charge you mean like what Tesla's offering, no, I don't think you can get that at your own home for a reasonable cost, simply because the type of electricity that's needed for that, no one has in their home. You could build it, but with like part wouldn't be possible, so you wouldn't be able to do it at a reasonable cost. But I think the important thing to think about with EV charging is not so much the time that it takes to fill your battery fully, because with EVs, I think generally with gas cars, it's pretty standard to drive it until the gas is pretty low and then fill it all the way up. But with EVs, if you can charge at home, it just doesn't really happen like that. If you drive 30 miles a day, maybe that's the US average, I don't know, something like that. Your regular 240 plug that a lot of people will have in their garage, if they have an EV, if you start the day at full, you drive your 30 miles and you come home, you're going to be full in and out. And so the idea of fast charging at home just isn't really necessary. because you're not really ever driving that full length. And if you do drive your full 250-mile battery in a day, you plug it in when you get home at night, and you're going to be full in the morning. So it doesn't really matter how long it takes to charge. It's kind of is maybe the other point when you're doing it at home. Public, totally separate, right?
Great. We are getting to the end of the questions. Okay, here, can the city of Boulder propose 3 or 4 options based on the options in your last slide to Xcel, and then get estimated cost and carbon reductions for these options? It is very hard for the community to express an opinion when we don't have a good sense of cost and carbon reductions. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we'll have an opportunity to do that in either in the just transition plan that I mentioned earlier, which is kind of like a midterm resource plan, and that'll be an opportunity to solicit resources for, like, say 2028, 2029, 2030. And so in the context of that, that's one opportunity that I think we'll have to make that proposal. I think another option would just be to do it as a separate application as well, depending on what we, what options are available. Do we want to look at technology? Do we want to do it as part of the resource plan? But yes, I think there will be options. There will be more concrete, proposals before anyone needs to make a decision on if they want to participate in that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Here's it says, what about encouraging charging at places of business?
I'm for it. I think particularly because we know that emissions are relatively low during the day, and it's great if you have home charging, but if you're not home during the day, you can't really take advantage of the lower emissions. So if you're going to be at work for 8 hours, it kind of makes sense in a certain way. But to that extent, it's kind of, there are incentives available that we've supported for a number of years for businesses to be able to add EV charging. We certainly provide guidance and advising on applying for those incentives. So, I think we're supportive of anyone.
Okay, I guess there's a follow-up question to that. Is the city encouraging the daytime charging at work?
Yes, we are. I think that's what we've been trying to do over the last several years, is make transparent all of the information, what emissions are at different times of day and what renewables are available, so that customers can just make that information. We, as the city, we don't have that information right now, so we'd like it to be available so that we can encourage it.
Okay, we're getting down there. Will Colorado be on track to reduce our emissions if we are getting massive AI centers that are creating such a huge demand that Xcel and others default to fossil fuels because there are not enough renewables online? Also, will the investment in infrastructure needed to serve AI be passed on to all ratepayers, and who in the city is focused on the burden of rate increases to both residents and businesses? So there are a lot of pieces to that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to the first one. Other than to say that to the extent there's more electricity usage because of AI, we're going to do everything we can to make sure it's met by renewables, and that the default is not simply to gas. I think when Xcel does a resource solicitation, there's no preference on resource types. It's just like, here's the services that we need. Can you provide, and if so, at what price? Second question was, what was the second question?
The second one is also, will investment in infrastructure needed to serve AI be passed on to all ratepayers, and who in the city is focused on the burden of rate increases to both residents and businesses?
Yeah. So generally speaking, if the cost to provide electricity or provide infrastructure to customers is borne by those customers in that class. So if there's like a data center customer that has a new class, it's a new type of customer. Let's say there's residential, there's small commercial, there's large commercial, and now there's like AI customers. All of the costs to serve them to those AI. Similarly, if they're part of, say, the large commercial class, all those costs are going to be there. So that those aren't really going to affect like the residential customers. There's still a bigger picture question of building broader infrastructure and building power generation to meet that. And that's where the city participates in rate cases and intervenes to ensure that those costs, to try to make sure that those costs are actually spread as they should be. So there's not costs for residential or commercial customers and residential customers and so forth. And yeah, so the city does, generally speaking, intervene in electric rate cases.
Great, Matt. You have successfully run the gauntlet. And so the last person here said, thanks, Matt. You're a rock star today. Really appreciate you taking these hard questions head on. And I can say a little more than that. So thank you, Matt. And I'm going to turn it back to Mary to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And please, call or email. I'm happy to continue the conversation on any of these topics or others.
Fantastic, Matt. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your being here tonight. And again, bravely facing all of the questions that came up. And now, before we all head out of here, I want to take a moment to thank the other Empower Our Future communication team members who are integral to making these Empower Hours happen. That would be Paul Cullen, Chris Hoffman, Steve Whitaker, and Julie Zonheiser. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good evening. Thank you.